back a year ago.
Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Beer Bound podcast. In today's episode, we're delighted to be joined by Amanda Siebert. Amanda is an award-winning journalist, best-selling author, and podcast host interested in the relationship between health and altered states of consciousness. She is a contributing writer at Forbes, DailyOm, and Healing Maps, and has bylines in over a dozen other publications. Her first book, The Little Book of Cannabis, How Marijuana Can Improve Your Life, published in 2018, was published on the same day that cannabis was legalized in Canada. Very cool. In 2019, it was named the #1 selling cannabis book in the country. In her second book, Psyched, 7 Cutting-Edge Psychedelics Changing the World, published in 2022, she breaks down the history, science, and cultural and medical uses of 7 psychedelic drugs. She is also the host of the podcast Ibogaine Uncovered, a podcast that explores a powerful drug being used to end substance use disorder, PTSD, and depression. In our pursuit to learn more about interesting substances all over the world beyond our love of beer, we're very excited to speak to Amanda and learn more about her expertise and knowledge in the complex landscape of psychedelics, cannabis, and beyond. So without further ado, Amanda, welcome to the Beer Bound podcast. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here.
The pleasure is ours, to say the least. Okay, well, we touched a little bit on you, but maybe can you go a little bit further into your expertise, your knowledge in the psychedelic world, maybe some of your background?
Well, I am a journalist, reporter, and author. I am not a scientist. I should preface that. I know people sometimes they'll come to me with these sort of really high-level questions, and I have to remind them I am but a translator of the knowledge. That's kind of how I like to position myself. That's sort of how I've written my books. The idea is that anybody could pick up one of my books, having little to no knowledge on something like cannabis or psychedelic drugs, and put them down, having a little bit more confidence around making decisions on whether or not to use these substances. So I would say my start to covering this kind of very niche corner of journalism started with my own use of these substances. I began as a journalist, as a generalist at an urban weekly publication here in Vancouver called The Georgia Straight. And there I wrote about everything from food to beer to movies to books. And sometimes I got to write about cannabis. Writing about beer was actually I guess you could say that was probably the first substance that provides an altered state that I got to write about as a journalist. And then cannabis really sort of was the entry point to writing about psychedelics and things like that. And yeah, it's a really interesting thing to be covering, especially now as we see more and more discussion on this, in the media. I just came back from a conference in Denver where 12,000 people were there to learn about psychedelics and how they're being used in different ways around the world. So it is no longer a niche subject, I would say.
Well, Amanda, can you maybe we could start with cannabis. Can you tell us a little bit about how your relationship started with this particular substance?
Totally. I'm not gonna, I'm pretty open about my use and how I was introduced to this substance. At 14 years old, I smoked my first joint while at a punk rock concert. And, I think that's a common story. I think a lot of people were first introduced to cannabis as teenagers. And I know there's a lot of stigma around this. It really wasn't until I was in college that I began using it regularly. And people think of a regular consumer of cannabis, and perhaps they have this image in their mind of someone who's lazy and not getting things done. But actually, I started using cannabis regularly when I was in college because I didn't want to drink every weekend. I did enjoy a beer here and there, but I saw the effects it was having on my life. If I was drinking on a Thursday, a Friday, a Saturday, maybe a Sunday with friends to, blow off some steam. The following week, I wasn't feeling that hot. And I noticed that the more I decided to swap cannabis for alcohol, I wasn't feeling as rough. And so that's sort of how it began. And then I would say I became more and more mindful and intentional about how I was using it. You know, if I jump back to what I just mentioned about the stereotype that people have about the stoner. At this time, I was in school. I had 2 or 3 different part-time jobs. I had a million other extracurricular activities. So by no means did I fit the the stereotype. And I think a lot of people who are using cannabis today are sort of more along that line. That there's some more intention behind the use, and it's not necessarily this like Cheech and Chong thing that we we grew up with, I guess.
Breaking the mold a little bit. I would
Mhm.
definitely agree with that. I have to ask though, what was the concert that you went to where you first consumed your
It
cannabis?
was a local band in my hometown of Richmond, BC, and the name you guys are gonna laugh because it's awful. Solemn Fist was the name of the punk rock band. Yeah,
Sounds like a punk rock name.
yeah.
Solemn
That's
Fist.
Mhm.
Okay, well, Amanda, your book pertaining to cannabis focuses a little bit on the beneficial sides of
Mhm.
cannabis. So I know you mentioned you're not a scientist, but can you delve a little bit further into how cannabis works and maybe some of the positive attributes that it gives to human beings? But maybe just start off by, what does it do to our bodies? Why do people indulge in cannabis in the first place, and what are the effects that occur when an individual does most likely smoke this substance?
I love this question. So I would say that I think the reason that people seek out cannabis is probably not far off from the same reason someone might drink a beer, and that's to, relax, to take the edge off. Often there's some, people talk about, particularly with cannabis, pain relief. And at higher doses, you mentioned smoking, but when we look at people who are consuming cannabis at higher doses in edible formats, perhaps, there's really a huge range of potential medical benefit that people have can experience and also have reported experiencing when it comes to really serious conditions like cancer. And so I would say in my book, basically, I break it down in 10 different ways that you can use cannabis in sort of a positive, beneficial way. One of those, as I just mentioned, is pain. A way that I've frequently have used cannabis in the past is to relieve a little bit of anxiety. That is person dependent. Some people do report that when they use cannabis, they get more anxious. So the reason cannabis is particularly challenging to study and challenging to sort of break down in this quick question is because it contains so many different compounds, and each of them can have a different effect on people, and a sort of are exhibited in different ways in different people. So something that you might consume that makes you feel euphoric and productive, and like you're just sort of let's call it a bit up, like lifted, I guess, might make me feel tired, kind of like I want to relax, a little more grounded. And so it's not as black and white as other substances. If you take this thing, then this will happen. But let's break down some of the other things that I talk about. Another thing that I discuss, and I didn't want to just make this book strictly medical. I also talk about how cannabis can use to stimulate creativity. I mean, if you think back to the 1960s and 70s, this is actually a really interesting thing to discuss, and it's been on my mind a lot lately, is that I was first introduced to these drugs not necessarily through reading about them, but through listening to music and taking in art and things that were created and thought of in sort of that came from altered states. And so I love the overlap there between music, between drugs, creativity. There's a whole there's a whole podcast there, I would say. And then another thing I talk about as well, and we've seen this in the sports world, is that a lot of athletes are using cannabis, after playing a game, to relieve pain they might have. I mentioned anxiety earlier. This is becoming more and more common. So that's something that's interesting in my mind to consider, especially because we've seen, up until the last couple of years, it's very, there's a lot of stigma attached to using any sort of drug if you're an athlete. So a lot of different things that I discussed, but those are some of the sort of more things that I guess would apply to the average folk. Yeah.
So I like that you mentioned that point. There's a couple good points, and I feel like I've definitely related to a few of those. And beat around the bush, I've definitely consumed my share of cannabis. Creativity was always a wonderful one. Pain relief, maybe not so much, but maybe nowadays a little more so. But you mentioned, how athletes are now taking that as a means to relieve pain or maybe even relieve stress. Since legalization in Canada, which was what seemed to be a very big feat. Do you think that stigma has been breaking down a lot? Have you seen big changes there? Do you think it's, progressing in a positive way, or are still people, kind of like, no against that? I guess professionals, I suppose.
I think I would say there has been a lot of progress as far as stigma. I think the fact that we can walk into a store and purchase cannabis, and like just that in itself is a really big deal. I think there are definitely some things that we need to work on as far as let's look at the fact that some people are still in prison in Canada, or that they are having a hard time getting their records expunged. There's a whole sort of discussion there, but I would say from a stigma perspective, a lot has been won. Some things that we might have lost with legalization are these discussions around the medical use of cannabis. I know a lot of people who have been sort of longtime medicinal users who are having trouble finding perhaps the particular strain or product that they were accessing before legalization, or perhaps the cost of their medicine has gone up. Those are some common things that I hear. But by and large, I think it's a really huge step for Canada to have taken. Certainly, there are some things with the legislation that I would tweak if it was up to me. But yeah, for the most part, I think it's very much a good thing. And I'm hopeful to see change happen in other places in the world and see how they do it. Because often the first person to or first country or whatever, first mover on something like this, it's a hard thing to do. So I wonder, how future iterations will sort of improve upon what we've done here.
Yeah, Amanda, I like what you said, or I agree rather with what you said about I think everyone would, around the stigma that's associated with even a substance like marijuana. I think you mentioned in your book, I think Canada is only the second country. I don't know if there's been more since then, but I think it was Uruguay and then Canada to actually legalize marijuana. There are other countries like the Netherlands or Portugal that maybe have decriminalized, but we actually legalized it for recreational consumption. So where do you think this stigma comes from? Garrett and I have focused a lot of our attention recently with other guests, some academic guests and some guests who know a little bit more about history, focusing on this period kind of about 100 years ago when North America, Canada, the United States, we really went to task on this concept of prohibition. So just saying, okay, alcohol is bad. It has, it's associated with ne'er-do-wells and terrible things associated with society. So, okay, let's get together and make legislation and completely ban it. And obviously that didn't work and probably created a lot more problems. It did. Statistically, it created more crime. Alcohol consumption didn't go down. It actually increased. So it's very fascinating to me that we have this wonderful case study. The United States, for example, had 13 years of prohibition, and then it was completely taken back. So we have this case study. Prohibition didn't work with this substance, alcohol, which I think most scientific professionals or folks in the nutrition world would actually say is a far more harmful substance than something like marijuana. So why is most of the world, I think in Canada, I struggle to say this for certain, but I think we're almost in a bubble where marijuana is quite tolerated and is quite normal. But if you go to any other country pretty much in the world, it's really not that, it's not such a, there's not tolerance for it. I'm thinking of recently some issues. I forget her name now, the American female basketball player who had her little vape pen in Russia and got sentenced to
Brittany
Griner.
Griner.
Yeah, Brittany
Yes.
Griner, exactly. Okay, so even in Russia, a European country that maybe has its own problems in other ways, I mean, there's no tolerance for marijuana at all. I know most countries in the world, there isn't that sense of tolerance for even the substance that most Canadians think, oh, it's just marijuana. But where do you think this stigma comes from? Why are we so, just globally speaking, still afraid of something that's kind of simple for most Canadians' point of view, which is marijuana?
This is a wonderful question. And to answer it, I'm going to read a quote from a guy named Terrence McKenna. And this quote is about psychedelics, but I believe that it applies to cannabis as well, because in my experience, cannabis has this kind of innate ability to sort of make you think a little bit differently about an issue. Like, here's a great example. Perhaps I'm dealing with some sort of conflict with, someone I'm working with or partner or whatever. I'm having trouble wrapping my mind around the situation. I have a bit of weed. And it's easier for me to sort of see, where this other individual might be coming from. Anyway, so I'm going to stop talking and read the quote now. Psychedelics and cannabis are illegal not because the loving government is concerned that you may jump out of a third-story window. They're illegal because they dissolve opinion structures and culturally lay down models of behavior and information processing. They open you up to the possibility that everything you know is wrong. And so if we think about cannabis as sort of the light version of this, let's look at, the 1960s is a cliche, but it's an example, a perfect example of what happens when a group of the population, in this case, hippies and people of color, decide to use these substances openly. They are loud and open about the fact that they're anti-war. They want to live in a different way. And the government is like, And so that's really a simple, the simplest way of showcasing why these substances have been made illegal. I think the fact that we're thinking differently about them now is a good thing. But I'm also, very aware of the fact that the system that we're still living in is one that is very, it's a capitalistic one in nature. And so the fact that these drugs are being more accepted, great. But I think we have a long way to go as far as how they're sort of worked into our modern culture and existence, I would say.
Wide range acceptance, I suppose, like maybe to relate it to something, that obviously Andy and I know quite well, and not just being beer, but alcohol in general. I feel like it's, alcohol is more widely accepted than anything else as an intoxicant, right? So it's, I guess, if you had to compare it to something, how do you bring it up to that level? I don't even know how you would, because there's just years and years of use and, advertising around alcohol, right? Cannabis is just now legalized for a very short time relative to alcohol. So there's definitely a big ladder to climb. But, I don't know if you had to come up with one way where you think cannabis might climb that ladder, whether that be a campaign of, promoting some of its benefits. Maybe there's subsidies or investment in research, because I know obviously it's been illegal for a very long time, and if we had some sort of science or data behind it, maybe that might prove to be beneficial and put everyone's stigma at ease. But anyways, throwing out a couple things, but maybe you have an idea of what might be the right path forward.
Oh, I totally agree with you that every initiative there that you mentioned would be totally necessary. What's really interesting about the way cannabis was legalized here in Canada is that it was done from a public health perspective. There was not really any interest or focus in educating the public about how the substance affects you, other than the negative way. So Here's an example. If I go into a cannabis store in my neighborhood and I talk to the bud tender and I ask them, I'm having trouble sleeping, can you recommend something that would sort of like, help me out a little bit? They're legally not allowed to tell me anything related to potential effects. They can say, well, they're forced to dance around the subject or say, I can't answer that, you might like this, but there's not that education component. It hasn't been baked into the legislation at all. And I don't think, I think that was intentional. This is something I've talked about before. For a short period of time, I was a freelance writer and during a copywriter, pardon me, and I was helping out the provincial government here in British Columbia on their cannabis information that would be, posted in the stores and online. And I had a really hard time, encouraging this group of people to understand why certain information was relevant and why certain information wasn't. And so like I think a lot of the stigma that is still attached to the substance has to do with the fear that people have around it. And it makes sense that we have that fear. We have 100 years, as you said, of like just misunderstanding and propaganda, really, that has convinced people that this plant is awful and kills your brain cells. And what's the commercial? We grew up with a commercial with the egg, the frying egg. This is your brain on drugs. Yeah.
I've seen a few of those for sure.
Yeah.
But also bud tender is amazing. I don't think I've ever heard that term before. And
Oh, really?
That's fantastic. And maybe to your point, like I've been into a couple cannabis shops and spoken with the bud tenders, as you say. And yeah, I never thought of it that way. If you give them some sort of symptom or this is kind of what I'm looking for as an effect, they've never really given me that answer. However, to their praise, they've been amazingly helpful, and I've been to a couple different spots, and they're very enthusiastic, they're very positive, they're very upbeat, and they're welcoming, which is great. But I feel like that needs to be, I guess, overdone just a little bit, to change people's minds, I suppose. But that's a good point. I never thought of it like that. They can't really talk to the effects and things of that nature, but it's interesting that you bring that up.
Yeah, it's definitely. Oh, sorry, please go ahead.
Amanda, if you, I guess in Canada now since 2018, so now we have 5 years of legalization with marijuana. If you had to give maybe a letter grade, A, B, C, D, or F, to maybe our federal government rollout of marijuana, how it's been done, maybe you can give us a letter grade and maybe a little bit of explanation on how Canada has fared so far in this kind of experiment, because we don't have too much other case studies to draw upon. How do you think we've done so far?
Yeah, I would say I would probably, is it a passing grade? No, I don't think so. I think this is a subpar piece of legislation. And I know that there's been work on it and meetings talking about what to change, but from what I've seen and heard, and from individuals I know who are in the business, people who grow great weed at brilliant companies that are doing it right, small, they're struggling, they're not doing well. And so if those people who are really in it, who have done all the work from, to transition from the legacy market and do the legal thing, if they're having a really, really hard time, then what's going on here? We hear about these large companies like Canopy and Hexo and Aurora, and we hear about all the money they got during the COVID pandemic and how they're misreporting on their earnings and all of this stuff. So I think there's so many examples of how this legislation has fallen short. So I would probably give it a D. I would give it a D if it was up to me. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting going over. I know you mentioned in the book you kind of have 10 major themes geared towards the positive repercussions of cannabis consumption. So it's funny, I'm going back to what you said earlier, your poke at the notion of of stigma and maybe its association with flawed capitalistic ideology. But it's so funny because I'm looking just over this list here, and it just seems like this is such a magical substance if in fact your statements are true, and I believe most of them probably are. I mean, I'll go over just a few of them. You mentioned already decreasing stress and anxiety, improving sleep, boosting mood and creativity, weight management, exercise recovery. You mentioned that. Cannabis as a superfood, a steamier sex life, which of course is very positive, an effective source of pain management, a powerful support for cancer treatment, easing the aging process. So these are all like amazing things. You think if you are a staunch hyper capitalist nation like the United States, you'd be chomping at the bits to find this miracle substance that could delve further into this potentially multi-trillion-dollar industry. So it's confusing to me. Maybe it's the idea that this concept of marijuana is maybe just too magical of a substance and it would shake up industries too much. Is that maybe fair to say, or what's the deal here?
I think you're definitely hitting some truth there. It's really hard. There's so many factors at play from a policy perspective. I think we definitely see on a state level, we definitely see what you're describing. Every time a state legalizes, there's this flood of interest. People, doing everything they can to get into the business, and that's great. But yeah, the reason that we're not seeing it legalized on a federal level, it's been frustrating as a journalist to cover this because it's changing all the time. We see all these things presented on the floor and different politicians who are in support, and it's to be frank, it's not something that I've paid attention to recently, simply because it's like a carrot that's been dangling in front of us for a very long time, and it's kind of exhausting.
Carrot is unappetizing anymore.
No, I mean, yeah, there's just so much to it, and I mean we've also got this psychedelic movement, which I think is sort of like the shiny object for a lot of people who once had all their focus on cannabis and sort of moving that further. So it's sort of been interesting to watch the division of attention focus on that as well.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, Garrett and I, as we've pondered many years of indulging and imbibing in beer and finding a passion for this particular substance, and then exploring more multifaceted ramifications of beer. Obviously, it's not the most healthy of a beverage. It leads
but it's
to
so delicious.
But it's very delicious.
That is the argument.
Yeah, and maybe above everything else, if I had to make my list of 10 things why I love beer, probably at the top would be what it does for me as a social lubricant. And if I go back if I take a trip down memory lane and I think about all these wonderful conversations and occasions with friends and family, a lot of them are under the influence of alcohol, mostly being beer. So if I had to take those away, if I had to take away those magical moments in my heart and in my soul, it would be kind of hard to say, get rid of alcohol, even though it does have negative health effects and all the other laundry lists of the negative attributes associated with it. But with the 10 positive connections that you've made to one's health and lifestyle connected with cannabis, can you pinpoint maybe the most important one that you feel exists for society at large?
This might take me a moment. I think it's that notion that I was sort of discussing earlier before, and maybe we can relate it to what I've written about on creativity, but this idea that you can sort of think about something in a little bit of a different way. It's sort of like looking at something from a bird's eye perspective, and just to touch on the notion, or this what you've just mentioned, this idea of alcohol as a social lubricant. Absolutely. I think when we look at a lot of these studies and this information that's coming out lately about how alcohol is bad for you. Let's just put it simply. That's what they're saying.
No doubt.
Yeah. None of that accounts for the social implications. We're not talking about like people who might be really shy and maybe that one or two beers like really just gets them to a place where they're able to open up a little bit more. So I think our conversations on substances in general are so they're really on the surface, like alcohol bad, cannabis good. This, like, even cannabis has, some people not good for them. It's definitely not good for them if you have a history of bipolar disorder, or perhaps you don't know about your family's mental health history. There's definitely reasons that a person should not be using cannabis. So I think our conversations on all of these substances really need to take this like broader, this high level approach, because they're not just good or bad. Yeah, there's a reason we've been, humans have been drinking for as long as we've been around. I mean, it creates that sort of that social lubricant, as you mentioned, that's so important, and it can be important in relationship building and all of these different things in life. So to back it up and answer your question, I would say that it's that idea that having a little bit of cannabis, however you might do that, can open your mind, man. not to sound stereotypical, but yeah, I guess that's kind of what I'm saying.
I feel like everyone can do with taking, a situation or the world in a different lens from time to time.
For sure.
Even I look at myself, and Andy and I do Rolling Hops as our fun business that we love, but we each have our own day jobs. And myself, I'm a people manager by day, and just in a management view, sometimes you just have to take a step back, don't react on impulse, and maybe some of that relates to the use of cannabis for those wouldn't even think of doing it. I'm not condoning managers to just go and smoke cannabis by any means, but take things with a grain of salt, look at things in a different lens. I think it has that, and just a general explanation has a lot of purpose to it. So I would definitely agree with that.
Amanda, I want to get to your second book, but I think I'll do a creative segue in that my final question for the Little Book of Cannabis is, in your opinion, is cannabis a gateway drug?
Yes, but my answer is not gonna isn't why it's not the typical answer. I would say that cannabis is a gateway drug to other plant medicines, and that's kind of what it has been for me. I know that obviously there's this sort of Reagan-esque argument that cannabis is a gateway drug to things like cocaine and heroin, but I would disagree. I think cannabis put me on the path of learning about things like psilocybin mushrooms and LSD and other drugs. And I think if you look at, again, the sort of 60s, 70s reference, that's sort of what happened there as well. That's not to say, for some folks it isn't a gateway drug to hard drug use, but to say that it isn't would be a lie.
All righty. Well, let's get into it then. So we have book number 2. This was published last year, I believe. So Psyched, 7 Cutting Edge Psychedelics Changing the World. All right. So I like your books because they're listed. I like books that have a certain amount of, it's in list form, kind of chronologically in a way. So you kind of go over the classic psychedelics, number 1 being psilocybin, which I think a lot of people associate with magic mushrooms. So can you go into a little bit, can you explain to Garrett and I what is psilocybin and what are magic mushrooms?
Okay, so psilocybin is the naturally occurring compound that is found in different species of magic mushrooms. So magic mushrooms are a group of fungi. There are over 200 species of them. They're found on every continent in the world. Some of the one you might have heard of is called Psilocybe cubensis. Another one you might have heard of that's very common in North America. It goes by the Liberty Cap. That's a nickname for it. And even though we're just hearing about them now in media and it's becoming more and more popular, humans have been using psilocybin containing mushrooms for a very long time. And if we go back, this is something I write about a little bit in my book. Magic mushrooms were first sort of introduced to North American culture in the late 1950s, when a fellow by the name of R. Gordon Wasson decided to take a trip down to Mexico. He visited this village where mushrooms were used in sort of a very ritualistic, spiritual way. They're a very critical part of the community there. And so he took some photographs and wrote the story and brought the story back to North America. And, within a few years' time, North Americans were sort of flooding to this community to experience the magic mushroom. And that was sort of where they got that name from. So when we look a little bit more closely at psilocybin, this active compound in magic mushrooms, this is the substance that's being studied. We're reading about sort of in headlines. And what studies are sort of showing is that in a therapeutic context, psilocybin has antidepressant effects. It's helping people with things like anxiety and post-traumatic stress disorder in some cases. So yeah, that's sort of the kind of why we're reading about it in that context. And this wave of research kicked off, I would say, in the mid 2000s, when a fellow by the name of Roland Griffiths decided to study psilocybin for end-of-life anxiety. So a group of participants who were perhaps suffering from cancer decided to participate in this. They took psilocybin, and what he found was that by and large, the participants in this study had almost no anxiety about death when they were finished, and many of them classified that experience as one of the most meaningful experiences of their lives to date. So that was sort of the study that got people asking questions, and that's kind of where we're at today with a sort of huge explosion of study and interest in these drugs.
It's definitely been, popping up all over the place. So I guess you'd say it was, maybe you said that study was in 2000. You think that has been spurred, and then up until, it seems like almost maybe the last 2 or 3 years, though, we've really seen a lot of headlines. It's been in the news lately. Do you think it's more of a continuation of that 2000 study, or is there another catalyst, do you think?
I think that has a lot to do with it. And I think also when we look at just the mental health crisis that people are talking about, I mean, yeah, I think a lot more people are really just suffering from this, from depression, from anxiety. And when we look at this sort of like system that we're living in, Gabor Mate is an author. I love reading his work, and he talks about how it's hard to be well in a sick society. And so I think that's something that I keep in mind when we're talking about, mental health and depression and anxiety and things like that. Oftentimes people are like, oh, they really take it on themselves when they're suffering from something like that. But it feels like more and more people are really at a place where they need something to sort of help them through life. And I think seeing these substances emerge as a potential solution has a lot to do with that need. So I think, yes, an increased look at these drugs from an academic perspective has something to do with it, but also we do have this massive body of knowledge around cultural uses of these drugs that has existed for a lot longer than the scientific data. And so what we're learning from people who use these drugs in cultural ways is that they are able to help us with the things that we're dealing with as a society. So I think it's a combination of those sort of bodies of knowledge kind of coming together.
Amanda, if you had to take another illegal substance that exists in Canada, would you say that magic mushrooms are perhaps the next step if we were to have another substance that would potentially go down the line of legalization, maybe in the near or not so near future? Would magic mushrooms be the next substance? And the reason I say this, in Canada and more urban locations, I know in Toronto, I suspect this is true in Vancouver too, but you can correct me if I'm wrong, there are actual locations, shops popping up that are selling magic mushrooms. And
Mhm.
to the best of my knowledge, it's not legal, and these places do get shut down from time to time, but I think they kind of pay a little fine and then they're open up the next week. So it seems like the tolerance for magic mushrooms, like the sense of really cracking down on the criminality of magic mushrooms, seems extremely low, particularly in urban Canada. So would you say that maybe in the next 5-10 years, this could be the next substance that we would see potentially tabling legislation to legalize?
I think there's definitely a possibility for that. It's really interesting to me, this sort of phenomenon that we've seen with that you mentioned, the stores opening up. I mean, I think there's like about a dozen of them in Vancouver. Uh, I've written about that as well, and it's just you're very right in that there's almost no yeah, there's no reason for people to not open these stores. I mean, yes, the substance is still very much illegal. Psilocybin, I think, is a on Schedule 3 in Canada. So yeah, by by all means, should not be being sold at the retail level. But here we are. I think you can order them. I know you can order them online fairly easily. Um, and I think the tolerance has a lot to do with these discussions we've been having around mental health and things like that. But do I think that psilocybin will be the next substance legalized? I'm hesitant to say yes, only because when we look at the work that's being done in the United States on MDMA, um, this substance, many folks who are sort of working on that policy change and that movement with the FDA, they believe that MDMA is sort of going to be the first substance through the FDA or the FDA approval process, pardon me. And so that's a really significant piece for any drug that is, sold legally. And I don't know that psilocybin being a naturally occurring substance, it's very hard to monetize if you're in drug development. And so the motivation to do that, I think, is a little bit lower with a drug like psilocybin. However, for folks who are struggling from, or pardon me, for people who are suffering from a life-threatening illness, there is actually policy in place where, with the help of a physician, you can apply to Health Canada to basically have psilocybin legally used in a therapeutic context. So I've interviewed a few people who have gone through this process. It's not easy. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of paperwork, but there is sort of a pathway there for medical purposes. So I think that's a wonderful thing. Again, policy that needs work and tweaking. But as far as the next drug that we see legalized, it's really hard to say whether that will be MDMA. That really depends on what we see on the FDA side in the United States, or if psilocybin will perhaps be legalized, medicalized, decriminalized. I would say that within the next 5 to 10 years, these drugs will be more available. How that policy exists, I cannot say.
Okay, so you list the 4 classic psychedelics. Psilocybin is number 1, then you have LSD, then you have DMT and ayahuasca, and then the 4th is mescaline and sacred cacti. Is that right?
Mescaline,
and then
yeah.
Mescaline, sorry. And then you have number 5 is the one that you just mentioned, which is MDMA. Cleverly, you have a nice title there, From Ecstasy to Empathy. And this you label as an empathogen outside of the classic psychedelic. So what is an empathogen? How is MDMA different from something like LSD or psilocybin?
So the first 4 drugs that you mentioned are classic psychedelics. They work on the serotonin system in the body, and they work with a group of receptors called 5-HT2. MDMA works on a completely different system partially different system in the body. But the reason it's called an empathogen is when these drugs were first being formulated and used in this way, it was kind of noted that, wow, these really promote feelings of empathy. And so that was sort of why they were given that name. And I know sometimes people are confused by this idea of using MDMA, which many people associate with partying and, you know, a club drug, with therapy. But it really is that, like, I mean, if you've ever done the drug, that sort of ooey gooey feeling that you get, you know, you're hanging out with your friends, you want to tell everyone you love them, like that's actually really helpful in a therapeutic context, especially when you're, pardon me, especially when you're dealing with someone who is carrying a lot of traumatic memories. So for someone with PTSD, for example, it can be really hard to go back and revisit whatever the cause of that post-traumatic stress is. But when MDMA is sort of part of the picture in a therapeutic container, with the help of a therapist, what participants report in studies with these drugs in this condition is that they're able to revisit that memory, talk about it, work through that trauma in a way that they couldn't do without the drugs.
Interesting. So almost like, I guess, I don't, maybe cushioning is a bad way to describe it, but
I don't think so.
yeah, cushioning the ability to get help with it. But and I guess maybe like you said, you know, sometimes people see it as like a party drug, and it's, you know, all about clubbing and going out and having fun. But I imagine that's probably to a much higher extent you're using the drug as opposed to therapy, which I imagine would be much smaller. I'm just guessing, but yeah, I guess the difference is the controlled environment.
The environment is huge, huge with every drug, and I'm so glad you said that, because in the psychedelic sphere, people often talk about set and setting, and how critical these two things are. So set is a person's mindset. Where are they at? Are they, you know, in a good place? Are they grounded? Are they feeling, you know, awful and thinking about something that has them, you know, elsewhere? Or pardon me. And then on the note of setting, so where are you? Who are you with? Do you feel safe? These are important questions to ask before you take a psychedelic substance. This is a story I love to tell. My dad loves beer, does not do drugs at all. No cannabis, no psychedelics, not interested whatsoever. Every Christmas, I'm like, Dad, can we just smoke a joint? No. Anyway, so one time, he loves to tell me the story. One time he had a cigarette that was dipped in hash oil, and he didn't know. This was like in the 70s when people did weird shit like that. Pardon my weird stuff like that. And so he told me, he's like, oh, it was so bad. My head really hurt and I was having an awful time and I had to go home. And when I got older and I had cannabis myself, I asked him, you know, where were you and who were you with? And it turns out he was at a party where he didn't know the home. He didn't know any of the people that he was with. He didn't like the people that he was with. So these are all ingredients for a terrible time. And I question, you know, how would this experience have been different if those variables were different? So I think the stakes are even higher with psychedelics. And so it's really, really important that those things are considered. A safe place, being with people that you can trust, knowing that you have safe drugs, also critical, depending on what you're using. I mean, if you're taking mushrooms and, you know, naturally occurring things, you don't have to worry as much, but something like ketamine or MDMA, yeah, safe source, very important.
Yeah, I think definitely that's the grand narrative around a lot of psychedelics, is that you have to be in a good space, you have to be in a good environment, don't be with bad, negative people, because that'll send you down a pathway perhaps to hell. So I think,
Not
okay, so
a good
after
time.
no, I suspect not. So after MDMA, you have a couple more. You have the dissociatives, is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
And I'm gonna sound like such a square. You have ketamine, and is it I know it's Ibogaine, but Iboga?
Yeah, so you don't sound like a square, don't worry. This is actually like not a substance a lot of folks know about. And just to clarify to the audience, I call this section of the book about dissociatives, but this is not to say these are the only dissociatives. These are just two dissociatives that I put in the book. So ketamine, actually an incredibly widely used drug, used as an anesthetic, Someone I interviewed in the book about the substance told me that the first time he used it as a physician was on a child when he was giving them stitches so they would hold still. So a drug that is very much dose dependent. And when we get into these higher doses, this is sort of where we have the psychedelic effect. And that's where we see ketamine being used increasingly in clinics in the United States. And what people are reporting is that they are sort of able to interrupt their treatment resistant depression. So critical for someone who might be facing, suicidal ideation. It's a drug that has been shown to be helpful in that context. And then Ibogaine, the other drug that you mentioned, comes from a shrub that grows in West Africa called Iboga. And Ibogaine is a really interesting substance. This is actually the drug that my podcast is centered around. And Ibogaine is interesting because what it does is it has the ability to sort of stop the withdrawal symptoms that occur in an individual who's suffering from opioid use disorder. So there are actually centers and clinics throughout Mexico and in different parts of the world where people who are perhaps they've been prescribed opiates, and this is such a common story. I'm sure there are people you know of or you've heard of that they were prescribed something for an accident or an injury, and 5, 6, 10 years later they're still using opiates. They're having a hard time maintaining that prescription. Perhaps they have to go find another source and so on. And so Ibogaine, what this drug can do, like I said, is sort of when a person wants to stop, they can take this drug and it will eliminate that thing that keeps so many people from stopping taking an opiate, and that's the horrible withdrawal symptoms. So a really interesting drug, and I think it's kind of interesting that we don't really know that much about it. It's not that discussed, especially given this monumental problem in North America with overdoses and opiate addiction. So that is sort of the focus of that chapter, but this drug is also being used in other ways for people who have depression and PTSD and things like that. And so on the podcast, I talk about this drug more deeply because it's such a rich subject.
Yeah.
Seems very interesting.
Yeah, I've learned a lot. I listened to a few of your episodes, Amanda. It's very interesting because, to be honest, other than just passing of somehow that word has landed in my head a few times, but Ibogaine, I didn't really know very much about it. And I think it's very interesting that you're kind of delving to educate individuals more on this substance, because it seems like it does have some powerful repercussions in remedying individuals with problems with opioid consumption. So is there clinical analysis on Ibogaine or research done that would potentially foster some initiatives to have more acceptance for Ibogaine in for the use of alleviating individuals' consumption or addictions with opioids?
Yeah. So I recently spoke with a woman named Dr. Deborah Mash, and she's been studying this substance for 30 years and has a lot of data. Was one of the first people to look at it in this context. And as the sort of psychedelic kind of movement has grown, we're seeing more and more about this drug come to the surface. So I mentioned earlier, I was at this conference in Denver, and there was a lot of discussion around Ibogaine. In fact, what was interesting was to see the discussion around the veteran population in the United States. So the reason this is a kind of a critical population, particularly from a policy perspective, is that both Democrats and Republicans are really in support of anything that has to do with Democrats, with veterans. And we're seeing really this motivation to make these drugs available to that population for people who are suffering from PTSD and so forth. And so just a few weeks ago, the state of Kentucky has sort of announced that they are putting this initiative together to study Ibogaine, which is huge. Yeah, so that's sort of kind of the groundswell of support we're seeing for this drug and kind of why we're seeing it. But I'm really eager to see, I guess, what happens next with it.
Steps forward.
Amanda, if an individual came to you who basically said, I don't really know very much about psychedelics, but I'm interested in them. Perhaps they've tried magic mushrooms, maybe not even. Is there some recommendation or advice for this individual that you would give in terms of having a safe first experience or just sort of dipping their foot in? Is there sort of a staircase of kind of how you would go about experimenting? Does it really depend on what the individual is looking for and the certain experience that they're trying to achieve? What would you recommend to an extreme novice who is interested and keen on potentially experiencing psychedelics?
I would say start with educating yourself in every way possible. So if there's a particular substance that you heard about or you keep seeing it or you're like, "Oh, what is that?" Just start with that one. Don't overwhelm yourself with what are they all and what do they all do. That's a fool's errand. I would say just try and focus on whatever it is that's calling to you or speaking to you or that you keep reading about. And if that interests you, go do the rabbit hole thing, go deep. And if you feel increasingly like, okay, this is something I want to explore, there are so many different containers and ways to go about doing that. So for some people might prefer to go down to Peru and do ayahuasca with a shaman, and someone else might want to sit in a clinic with a therapist that holds their hand while they're wearing an eye mask over their eyes and listening to a curated playlist. And that is the spectrum. There are so many other things to choose from in between. So figuring out what sort of appeals to you, I think the most would be next. And it doesn't have to be complicated. The fellow that I quoted earlier, Terrence McKenna, uh, he says that, and I would not recommend this unless you are an experienced traveler, but his recommendation is that people consume 5 grams of mushrooms and sit in a dark closet to really get to know who they are. So again, there's a spectrum, right? I myself prefer to take a small dose and hang out with some friends in my living room, and we all pick our favorite album, and there's so many different ways you can go about doing that. So I would say if you're a complete novice, uh, educate yourself. Sorry, my Siri was talking to me. I don't know. I said something that triggered it. That yeah, if you're new to psychedelics, educate yourself in every way that you can. Don't overwhelm yourself. Pick something, stick with it, and then whatever resonates with you as far as how to go about that. Yeah, or send me a message. I love to talk about this stuff. Yeah.
Well, Amanda, we're coming up on our hour mark, so of course we want to be respectful of your time. But maybe I have one final question. I don't know if you have one, Garrett, but is there one of these particular substances, these psychedelics, that interests you the most, maybe potentially because it's a little bit unknown to you in terms of experimentation, or something that you're just a little bit more keen on exploring for yourself, maybe in the near future or the great future beyond?
Mm-hmm. I would say, I mean, yeah, the podcast is really speaks to my obsession with Ibogaine right now, really learning as much as I can about it. And it can be consumed in different ways. Ibogaine is that active compound in the plant, but Iboga is, the plant that it comes from. It's consumed as a root in Gabon. And so there's a whole kind of really cultural, ritualistic existence of this substance that I'm talking about that I have barely even touched on in my podcast. And that's really something that I'd like to explore. I think it's a trap that a lot of journalists in North America fall into, to sort of cover these drugs from like one side, just from the scientific side or from the research side or the medical side. And I really want to make sure that I am doing justice, to all these different aspects of the medicine. And I think the cultural piece is so critical. There's an entire body of knowledge that isn't really being talked about. So I think when it comes to any of these drugs, that's an important thing to consider. But that's one that I am, eagerly diving into and considering all the time.
I honestly just learned about it previous to the interview today with you, Amanda. So I'm very intrigued,
Cool.
and you've already pushed me to go and look at it a little bit further and learn a bit more. So
Awesome.
yeah, super interesting.
Yeah, I think it's very fascinating because this world is so vast and there's so much to explore, and really we are demonized as a society, or maybe discouraged from even thinking about such substances, certainly with our legal system. So I think your mantra and your philosophy of educating yourself is maybe the best thing for someone to do. I couldn't agree more. All right. Well, Amanda Siebert, author of The Little Book of Cannabis, How Marijuana Can Improve Your Life, as well as Psyched, 7 Cutting-Edge Psychedelics Changing the World. Be sure to check out her podcast as well, Ibogaine Uncovered, available, I think, Amanda, on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, all the rest.
Yep.
So, Amanda, thank you so much. I think Garrett and I learned a tremendous amount. Perhaps we can bug you again sometime to delve further deeper and potentially into maybe some future works that you're working on. I'm not sure. We didn't even really get to that.
Absolutely. No, I would love that. Thank you guys. It's been such a pleasure. And I really appreciated talking about these things with you. I would love to do it again.
Thanks,
Thank
Amanda.
you so much.
Be sure to subscribe to stay up to date on all our interviews and beer-related content. Remember, craft beer is here.